In 1970, while the muscle car world obsessed over horsepower numbers and drag strip bragging rights, Buick quietly unleashed something different. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but a big block that made more torque than any other American production engine of its time, while weighing a staggering 150 pounds less than a Chevrolet 454. This is the story of the Buick 455, the gentleman's muscle car that proved you didn't need peak horsepower to embarrass a Hemi at the stoplight. By 1970, General Motors had finally lifted its ban on engines larger than 400 cubic inches in intermediate cars. This restriction, which had been in place since 1963, had severely handicapped GM's divisions in the muscle car wars. While Chrysler was dropping 440s and 426 Hemis into everything with wheels, GM was stuck playing by its own rules. But when the floodgates opened for 1970, it was absolute chaos, the best kind of chaos. Chevrolet unleashed the legendary LS6 454 in the Chevelle, rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. This became the poster child of the muscle car era, the engine everyone remembers. Pontiac stuffed a 455 into the GTO. Oldsmobile had their own 455 in the 442. And then there was Buick. Now, Buick had always occupied an interesting space in GM's hierarchy. They weren't Cadillac, the luxury king, at the top. They weren't Chevrolet, the everyman's brand, at the bottom. And they certainly weren't Pontiac, GM's designated performance division. Buick was the brand for successful professionals who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The doctor, the lawyer, the business owner who wanted refinement with their performance. This philosophy carried directly into their engine development. While other divisions were building engines designed to rev high and scream, Buick took a completely different approach. They understood something fundamental about real-world driving. Most of your time isn't spent at 6,000 RPM. It's spent launching from stoplights, merging onto highways, and making that guy in the Camaro next to you question his life choices. Buick's lead engineer, Denny Manor, later explained their thinking perfectly. Buicks were heavy, loaded with power everything. That's how people bought them. Low-end torque was key because that's how people perceive performance. This wasn't about winning dyno contests. This was about building an engine that felt fast, an engine that pushed you back in your seat the moment you touched the throttle, an engine that made power where you actually used it. The Buick 455 was born from the brand's earlier big block program. In 1967, Buick had introduced a new V8 family to replace their iconic nailhead engines. This new design came in 400 and 430 cubic inch variants. For 1970, they needed to go bigger, but they did something clever. Instead of stroking the engine like Oldsmobile did with their 455, Buick bored out the cylinders. They took that 430 cubic inch engine with its 3.9-inch stroke and opened up the bore from about 4.19 inches to 4.31 inches. Same stroke, bigger bore. This gave them 455 cubic inches with a near-perfect bore-to-stroke ratio. But here's where it gets interesting. This boring out approach allowed Buick to use thin wall casting technology, one of the first applications of this advanced production method at GM. The result was revolutionary. The Buick 455 weighed approximately 150 pounds less than the Chevrolet 454. To put that in perspective, it was only about 25 pounds heavier than a small block Chevy 350. Think about what this meant for a performance car. You've got 7.5 liters of displacement, massive torque capability, but you're not destroying your front-to-rear weight balance. You're not overloading your front suspension. You're getting big block power with nearly small block weight. Now let's talk numbers. The base 455 for 1970 was rated at 350 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. Respectable, but not earth-shattering compared to the competition. But that torque figure? 510 pound-feet at just 2,800 RPM. Let me repeat that. 510 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM. To understand how insane this is, the LS6 454 made 500 pound-feet, but at higher RPM. The 426 Hemi made 490 pound-feet. The 446-pack made 490 pound-feet. The Buick made more twist than any of them, and it made it lower in the RPM range where you could actually use it on the street. But if you wanted the real weapon, you checked the Stage 1 option box. For $115, you got larger valves, stiffer valve springs, a hotter camshaft, cold air induction through functional hood scoops, and most importantly, a compression bump to 10.5 to 1. The official rating? 360 horsepower. 10 more horses than the base engine. That's what Buick claimed. But here's the thing. Nobody believed them. Not then, not now. Dyno testing from the era showed that the weakest Stage 1 engines coming off the production line were making 376 horsepower gross. The strong ones? North of 400 horsepower, potentially 420 to 425. Buick was sandbagging these numbers hard, likely to keep insurance companies happy and avoid attracting too much attention from regulators. Motor Trend tested a 1970 GS 455 Stage 1 and recorded a 13.38-second quarter mile at 105.5 miles per hour. They declared it the quickest American production car we've ever tested. That's faster than the LS6 Chevelle they tested, faster than the Hemi cars, faster than everything. Some people claim Motor Trend was testing a Ringer, a specially prepared car that Buick sent them. Maybe. But even in independent testing, bone stock Stage 1 cars were consistently running mid-13s. That tells you everything you need to know about how much power these engines really made. Here's something that gets lost in today's horsepower-obsessed culture. Peak horsepower numbers don't tell you the whole story. When you're looking at a dyno chart, what matters is the area under the curve. That's the usable power. That's what you feel when you're actually driving. The LS6 454 was an absolute monster, no question about it. But it was designed to rev. It made its peak power at 5,600 RPM. To access all that performance, you had to wind it out. You had to keep it on boil. On a drag strip with slicks and perfect conditions, this was ideal. But on the street, with bias ply tires, in traffic, the Buick's torque curve looked completely different. It came on strong at 2,000 RPM and stayed flat all the way through 4,500 RPM. This meant instant throttle response. It meant pulling hard out of every corner. It meant you didn't need to downshift to pass somebody on the highway. You just squeezed the throttle and watched them disappear in your mirror. This is where torque absolutely dominates in the real world, the launch. Think about a drag race or a stoplight Grand Prix. You're starting from a dead stop. The car that makes more torque at lower RPM is going to hit you in the chest harder. It's going to load the rear tires more effectively, and it's going to pull harder in that critical first 60 feet. The Buick Stage 1 was famous for its launch characteristics. Owners described them as stump pulling off the line. These cars would lift the front end and plant those rear tires with authority. The combination of massive low-end torque and relatively light weight for a big block meant these cars hooked and went. But here's the beautiful thing about the Buick approach. It didn't look like a threat. The GSX came in Saturn yellow or Apollo white with graphics, sure. But most GS 455 Stage 1 cars, they looked like a respectable businessman's coupe. Subtle Stage 1 badges on the fenders. That was it. You'd pull up next to one at a light, see what looked like your grandpa's Buick, and then get absolutely destroyed when the light turned green. No warning, no massive hood scoop, no obnoxious paint, just brutal, relentless acceleration. This was the banker's hot rod, the car that looked innocent but had the mechanical capability to embarrass anything on the street. Buick owners loved this. They didn't need the attention, they didn't need to prove anything, they just needed to win. Let's talk about how the Buick 455 Stage 1 stacked up against its contemporaries in the real world, not just on paper. Against the Chevrolet LS6 454 Chevelle, on paper, the Chevy had the advantage with 450 horsepower versus 360, but in actual testing, the gap was much closer. The Chevy might trap slightly higher in the quarter mile, but the Buick was often quicker to 60 miles per hour and through the first half of the track. Why? That torque, that instant hit of power that got the Buick moving before the Chevy even woke up. Against the 426 Hemi, the Hemi had mystique, no question, but it also cost a fortune, drank premium fuel like it was free, and needed constant tuning. The Stage 1 cost $115 as an option package. It ran on regular gas, it was dead reliable, and in many street races, it would take the Hemi because of that low-end torque advantage. Against the 440 six-pack, this Mopar mill made 490 pound-feet of torque. Good, but still 20 pound-feet short of the Buick. The six-pack needed all three carburetors working together to make power. The Buick had a single quadrajet and made more torque, simpler, more reliable, and brutally effective. Against the Pontiac 455, Pontiac's engine made similar torque numbers, but it was heavier. The entire car was heavier. The Buick had a weight advantage that translated to better acceleration and handling. Car and Driver tested multiple muscle cars in 1970. The GS 455 Stage 1 consistently finished at or near the top in acceleration tests. Hot Rod Magazine got similar results. These weren't magazine ringers or specially prepared cars in most cases. These were dealer stock vehicles that were simply faster than their competition. The really telling stat? Trap speeds. The LS6 Chevelle would trap at 107-108 miles per hour in the quarter mile. The GS 455 Stage 1 would trap at 105-106 miles per hour. So the Chevy had a tiny bit more top-end power, but the Buick's elapsed times were often quicker because it got off the line harder and carried that momentum through the first 1,000 feet of the track. The thin-walled casting was genuinely advanced for its time. Most big block engines used heavy castings with thick cylinder walls to ensure durability. Buick took a different approach. They used higher nickel content iron, which was stronger. This allowed them to use thinner walls without sacrificing strength. The cylinder bores on a Buick 455 could wear for 200,000 miles with minimal degradation because of that nickel content. The block was strong enough for street use and most performance applications, but significantly lighter than the competition. This wasn't just about saving weight for the sake of it, this was smart engineering. A lighter engine meant better weight distribution, better handling, less stress on the front suspension. And when you combine that with massive torque, you get a car that feels alive, that changes direction willingly, that doesn't plow through corners like a boat. Because Buick achieved the 455's displacement by boring out the 430 rather than stroking it, most parts were interchangeable between the 400, 430, and 455. The crank was the same, the rods were the same, the oil pump, the timing cover, the water pump, most everything except the pistons and cylinder heads would swap between engines. This made the 455 easier to build, easier to maintain, and cheaper to produce. It also meant that if you wanted to build a performance 455, you had access to parts from 3 different engines. The 430 had excellent rocker arms. The 400 had good rods. Mix and match, and you could build something special. Now, I need to be honest here. The Buick 455 wasn't perfect. It had one significant weakness: the oiling system. The through pushrod oiling setup was elegant and weight-saving, but it could starve for oil at high RPM. The oil passages, especially in 1970 blocks, were smaller than ideal. For street use, this wasn't really an issue, but if you were building a race engine, you needed to address it. Drilling out oil passages, upgrading to a better oil pump, adding a windage tray, maybe even adding a girdle to strengthen the block at higher power levels. These modifications turned the 455 into a legitimate 600-plus horsepower engine, but they were necessary for serious performance builds. The Buick 455's glory was short-lived. 1970 was the peak. By 1971, compression ratios were dropping across the industry to accommodate unleaded fuel. The Stage 1 went from 10.5 to 1 compression to 8.5 to 1. Power dropped accordingly. Then 1972 brought the switch from SAE gross horsepower ratings to SAE net. Suddenly, the 455 was rated at 250 horsepower. This wasn't really a power drop in many cases. It was just a different way of measuring, but it looked terrible on paper. The mystique was fading. Insurance companies were crushing young buyers with premiums. The oil crisis of 1973 made big blocks seem irresponsible. Emissions regulations kept tightening. By 1975, the 455 was making just 205 horsepower. In 1976, it was gone entirely, replaced by smaller engines that could meet the new corporate average fuel economy standards. Here's the thing. The Buick 455 never got the recognition it deserved because Buick didn't market it aggressively. They weren't Pontiac. They didn't build their brand identity around performance. They didn't sponsor race teams or advertise during football games with roaring engines and tire smoke. The GS 455 Stage 1 and GSX were produced in tiny numbers. Just 2,465 GS Stage 1 hardtops were built in 1970. Only 678 GSX models total. These weren't volume cars. They were specialty items for people who knew what they wanted. Meanwhile, Chevrolet was pumping out thousands upon thousands of Chevelle SS 454s. Pontiac was making GTOs by the boatload. Plymouth was advertising the hell out of the Roadrunner and GTX. Buick? They made an amazing engine, put it in an amazing car, and then sort of quietly hoped the right people would find out about it. Today, the Buick 455 has found its respect. Enthusiasts understand what it was. Classic car collectors are paying serious money for GS 455 Stage 1 cars. A good example can fetch well over $100,000, with the best examples approaching $200,000 or more. But more interesting is what's happening in the engine-building world. People are discovering that the Buick 455 is one of the smartest big block choices for a street performance car. That lightweight is a huge advantage. That torque character is addictive. And with modern machining techniques, you can strengthen the weak points and build something truly special. Engine builders are creating 550, 600, even 700 horsepower Buick 455s that are reliable and streetable. They're keeping the low RPM torque character that made these engines special, but adding modern technology, better oiling systems, stronger blocks with girdles, aluminum heads, fuel injection, electronic ignition. The result is an engine that drives like the original Stage 1, but with significantly more power and modern reliability. It's the ultimate sleeper engine. Nobody expects a Buick to be fast, which is exactly the point. The Buick 455 taught us something important. Peak horsepower isn't everything. Sometimes the smartest engineering solution isn't the one that looks best on paper, it's the one that works best in the real world. Buick built an engine that was lighter than its competitors, made more usable torque than anything else on the market, and could embarrass any muscle car at a stoplight. They did it without fanfare, without chest beating, without needing to prove anything to anyone. They built a gentleman's muscle car, and it was absolutely brilliant. Today, when everyone's chasing horsepower numbers and dyno sheets, it's worth remembering the Buick philosophy. Torque wins races, and it definitely wins street fights. The 455 Stage 1 proved it in 1970, and it's still proving it today in the hands of builders who understand what made it special. That's the Buick 455, the torque monster that didn't need horsepower to be one of the greatest American engines ever built. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Buick 455, hit that like button and subscribe for more content on classic American engines. Drop a comment and let me know. Would you take a 1970 GS 455 Stage 1 over an LS6 Chevelle? I'm curious to hear what you think. See you in the next video.